The boardroom doors opened, and Mark's whole life split in two: the past he buried, and the billionaire CEO who now controlled his future. Mark stood in front of the bathroom mirror for the third time, adjusting his tie like it was somehow the thing that would decide whether his life finally got better or stayed stuck in survival mode. The apartment was small, the kind of place where you could hear the neighbor's TV through the wall and the fridge made a tired buzzing sound at night, but it was clean and it was theirs, and that counted for something. Out in the living room, Lily was perched on the couch with her knees pulled up, a cartoon playing low in the background while she focused on her cereal like it was an important job. She was 9, sharp in a way that made him both proud and slightly afraid, because kids that observant noticed everything, even the things you tried to hide. Mark forced a smile when he stepped out, smoothing his shirt and pretending he wasn't nervous. "How do I look?" he asked. Lily glanced up, took one slow bite, and nodded like a tiny judge in a courtroom. "You look like you're trying too hard," she said, then added, "But it's okay. First days are like that." Mark laughed under his breath, because she was right, and because it was strange to hear wisdom from a kid who still needed help reaching the top shelf. He leaned down and kissed the top of her head, breathing in the clean, familiar scent of her shampoo. And for a second he let himself feel what he rarely allowed, the weight of how much he loved her and how much pressure came with being the only parent in the room. He'd been up before dawn, packing her lunch, checking her homework folder, setting out her jacket, and leaving a note on the counter for the neighbor who'd be walking her to school. It was a system he'd built carefully, like a fragile structure made of routines and small favors, because he didn't have family nearby and he couldn't afford mistakes. The new job was supposed to be the turning point, the kind of job that didn't just pay bills but actually gave them breathing space. A tech company with a name people recognized, the kind of place that offered health insurance without a fight, and a salary that didn't feel like an insult. Mark had stared at the offer email for a full minute when it came in, waiting for the catch, waiting for someone to tell him it was an accident. But it wasn't. They wanted him. And even though he told himself it was because he earned it, because he worked his way up from smaller roles, because he learned new skills late at night after Lily went to bed, there was still a part of him that felt like a fraud walking into a room full of people who probably came from better backgrounds, people who didn't have to choose between groceries and a car repair. The morning air bit at his face when he stepped outside. He locked the door, checked his pocket for keys, checked again, then headed for the train with his laptop bag slung over his shoulder. On the ride downtown, he watched his reflection in the window, the tired lines around his eyes that didn't match his age, the way his jaw kept tightening without him noticing. He tried to picture the office, bright spaces, confident people, a clean desk with his name on it. He tried to imagine the version of himself who belonged there, but anxiety is stubborn. It sits in your chest like a stone and tells you every old story you've ever believed about yourself. By the time he reached the building, he could feel his heartbeat in his throat. The lobby was tall and glossy, full of steel and glass and quiet money. A security guard checked his ID, smiled politely, and directed him to the elevators. Mark nodded like he did this all the time, but inside he felt like a kid sneaking into a place he wasn't supposed to be. Upstairs, the office hit him with motion and sound. People walked fast, talking into headsets, laughing in clusters, carrying coffee like it was fuel. Screens glowed on every wall. The space smelled like fresh paint and expensive air freshener. Someone from HR met him near the front, a cheerful woman with a bright smile who handed him a badge and a welcome packet like it was a gift. "You must be Mark," she said. "We're excited to have you." Mark thanked her, trying to match her energy, trying not to sound like he was out of breath. She led him through the maze of desks and conference rooms, pointing out the kitchen, the break area, the restrooms, the whole world of perks that felt almost ridiculous to him. He nodded, smiled, tried to memorize faces, but it all blurred together. Names slipped out of his head as soon as he heard them. Every handshake felt like a test. Every introduction made him wonder what people saw when they looked at him. Did they see a capable professional, or did they see someone who didn't fit the polished look of the place? By late morning, he'd met his manager, set up his email, and attended a quick orientation. He sat through a presentation about company culture and innovation and big goals, but he only half heard it because his mind kept drifting to Lily. Was she at school yet? Did she remember her lunch? Was she okay? He checked his phone once, saw no messages, and forced himself to relax. When the presenter mentioned the CEO would be dropping by the onboarding meeting after lunch, his attention snapped back. The CEO. He'd heard about her in the interview process, mostly in careful, respectful language. A visionary, a powerhouse, tough but brilliant, someone who expected excellence. Mark wasn't naive enough to think he'd be chatting with her like a friend, but just knowing she'd be in the same room made his palms sweat. He straightened in his chair, smoothing his sleeves, listening harder, as if preparation could protect him. After lunch, they were guided into a boardroom with a long table and a wall of windows that looked down on the city like the building owned it. Mark took a seat near the middle, placed his notebook neatly in front of him, and tried to breathe in a steady rhythm. People chatted softly, sharing little first-day jokes, but Mark stayed quiet, watching the door. He told himself this was just a meeting, nothing dramatic, nothing personal, just a CEO saying hello. He didn't know, not yet, that the next few minutes were going to crack open a part of his life he'd sealed shut years ago. He didn't know the face that was about to walk through that door would be the one he'd once carried in his mind like a secret, the one he'd never fully replaced with anyone else, the one he thought he'd lost for good. The boardroom felt too bright, too clean, like a place where mistakes couldn't exist without being noticed, and Mark sat there trying to keep his breathing steady while his mind ran through every possible way to make a good first impression. Around him, the other new hires whispered and laughed softly, the kind of nervous friendliness people put on when they want to belong quickly. Mark nodded at a joke he barely heard and kept his eyes on the door, telling himself this was normal, that it was just the CEO stopping by to give a welcome speech and shake hands for a few minutes. He'd built the moment up in his head anyway because he'd spent years in jobs where the people at the top were ghosts, names on emails, distant signatures on pay stubs. Here, the CEO was a legend you could actually see, and that made the company feel heavier, more real, like it could either lift you up or crush you depending on what she thought of you. Someone at the far end of the room straightened in their chair as footsteps approached, and the conversation dropped in volume like a switch had been flipped. Mark's stomach tightened. The door opened, and time didn't slow the way it does in movies. It stopped completely, like the air froze in place. Sarah walked in with two assistants behind her, and for a second Mark couldn't understand what he was seeing. She looked older, obviously, but it wasn't just age, it was the way she carried herself, like she was used to rooms bending around her. She wore a simple suit that probably cost more than his rent, hair cut into a sharp style that framed her face, and her expression was calm in the way of someone who'd learned to show only what benefited her. Yet when her eyes swept the room, he saw it, that familiar spark, that exact shade, that look that used to make him forget his own name when he was 12 and she leaned close to whisper something like it was meant only for him. Mark's throat went dry. He gripped the edge of his notebook so hard he felt the cardboard bend under his fingers, and the part of him that was an adult, a father, a professional, tried to step in and say this was impossible, it couldn't be her. There were millions of people in the world. There was no reason his past would show up here, in a boardroom, in a city he moved to only a few years ago. But it was her. It was Sarah, the girl who once sat beside him on the school bus and made fun of the way he always overpacked his backpack. Sarah, who used to race him to the corner store after school and split a candy bar with him, laughing when the chocolate melted on their fingers. Sarah, who wrote her name in his notebook once and drew a tiny heart around it because she was bold like that, bold enough to make him feel brave just by standing near him. He blinked hard, and the room snapped back into motion, except Mark's body didn't catch up. People stood, chairs shifted. Someone said, "Good afternoon," like it was a church service. Sarah smiled at the group, a controlled, practiced expression, and moved to the head of the table. Mark forced himself to stand too, but his legs felt weak, like he'd been running. She greeted the HR lead, exchanged a few quick words, then faced the room. "Welcome," she said, voice clear and steady, a voice built for confidence and decisions, not playground secrets. Mark listened, but his mind was already slipping backward, dragged there by her presence whether he wanted it or not. He saw a sunlit classroom, Sarah turning in her seat to pass him a folded note, her handwriting messy and impatient. He remembered the note said, "Meet me after school, don't be late." He remembered the way his heart pounded as he walked to the swings behind the gym, and how she was already there, feet dragging in the dirt, eyes bright like she was holding something important. She told him she was moving, not across town, but far, far away, the kind of move kids don't understand until it happens. Mark remembered trying to act tough, trying to joke, failing. He remembered Sarah stepping closer and pressing something into his hand, a little keychain shaped like a star. "So you don't forget me," she said. He'd kept it for years, tucked into a drawer, and even after life got crowded with responsibility and heartbreak, he never threw it away. Then he remembered the promise he made, the one that haunted him now because he'd said it like it was easy. "I'll write you. I'll come see you one day." He meant it too, but then his mom got sick, his family fell apart in quiet ways, money got tight, and childhood promises became the first things to die. He wrote one letter and never mailed it, or maybe he mailed it and it came back he couldn't even remember anymore. All he knew was that Sarah vanished, and over time he convinced himself she forgot him, because forgetting was the only thing that made it feel less like abandonment. Sarah kept speaking, thanking people for joining the company, talking about innovation and ambition, but Mark barely heard the words because his attention kept pulling toward her face, searching for something human behind the CEO mask. Then, as if she felt his gaze, she looked directly at Mark. Mark's breath caught so sharply it almost made a sound. Her eyes held his, and the smallest crack appeared in her composure, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for him. The corner of her mouth tightened, her chin lifted slightly like she was bracing. In that one silent exchange, Mark saw recognition, unmistakable and immediate, and something else too, something colder, like pain wrapped in control. He wanted to look away, to break the moment, but he couldn't. It was like the past reached across the table and grabbed both of them by the throat. Sarah blinked first, then moved on, scanning the rest of the room like he wasn't special, like he was just another employee. But Mark knew what he had seen. His heart hammered in his chest as if it was trying to warn him. Whatever this reunion meant, it wasn't going to be simple. The girl he once adored was now the person who could define his future with a single decision, and the expression in her eyes told him she hadn't forgotten anything. Mark spent the rest of the afternoon moving like he was underwater, hearing voices but not fully catching the words, nodding at coworkers while his mind kept replaying that single moment of eye contact like a scene that refused to end. He tried to focus on the basics, the things that should have mattered on a first day. The training modules, the passwords, the project overview, the polite smiles that came with being new. But Sarah's presence had rewired the entire day, turning what was supposed to be a clean beginning into something messy and personal. Every time his phone buzzed with a new email, he felt a sharp spike of dread, half expecting her name to appear in the sender line. When his manager introduced him to the team and talked about upcoming deadlines, Mark smiled and asked the right questions, yet his thoughts kept drifting to the impossible fact that Sarah was real. She was here, and she was the CEO. Not a memory, not a what if, not a passing thought from an old school photo, but a person with authority and power, and the kind of influence that could reshape his life without even trying. He kept telling himself it didn't matter, that he was an adult now, a single father, a man with responsibilities that didn't leave room for unfinished childhood stories. But the moment he sat at his desk and opened the welcome packet again, he found his hands shaking just slightly, like his body was still catching up to what his brain already knew. Right after the onboarding meeting, an email arrived from Sarah's executive assistant, short and formal, requesting Mark's presence at a project briefing at 4 o'clock in the CEO's office. No explanation, no warm welcome, just a time, a place, and the kind of tone that didn't invite negotiation. Mark read it twice, then a third time as if the words might change. He glanced around the open office, wondering if anyone else had gotten the same message, but no one looked up from their screens. Dev, the friendly engineer from earlier, walked past and gave him a quick nod, and Mark forced himself to act normal, even as his stomach tightened into a hard knot. He told himself this was a good sign. CEOs didn't call random new hires into their office unless they saw potential. That was the smart way to think about it. The problem was, Mark wasn't sure what Sarah saw when she looked at him. Potential, maybe. Or maybe she saw the boy who promised to write, then vanished without explanation. Maybe she saw a loose end she never got to tie off, and now she finally had her hands on the string. At 3:58, Mark stood outside the CEO's office with his badge hanging a little crooked and his palms damp despite the cool air conditioning. The hallway was quiet, the kind of quiet that made every footstep feel too loud. He could see through the glass wall into Sarah's office, a wide, spotless space with a view of the city, a desk that looked more like a command center, and Sarah herself standing near the window with her back turned, phone pressed to her ear. Even from behind, she looked controlled, like she belonged to this world completely. Mark swallowed, straightened his shoulders, and knocked softly. The assistant opened the door and gave him a professional smile that didn't mean anything. "Go ahead," she said, then slipped away. Mark stepped inside and the door clicked shut behind him, sealing him into a space that smelled faintly of clean wood and expensive perfume. Sarah ended her call without looking at him, set the phone down, and turned slowly as if she was measuring the moment. When her eyes met his again, Mark felt that same jolt, that sharp collision of the past with the present. Only now it was more intense because they were alone. "Mark," she said, and his name sounded different in her voice than it had in his memory, less playful, more precise, like it was a file label. He forced himself to nod. "Miss Carter," he replied, keeping his tone respectful, professional, safe. For a flicker of a second, something tightened in Sarah's expression, like she disliked the distance he created. Then she walked to her desk and slid a folder toward him without ceremony. "You're assigned to the Horizon rollout, and I want you on the security and product integration side." Mark blinked, surprised. That wasn't entry-level work. That was high visibility, the kind of project that could either make a career or destroy it if you failed. "I'm honored," he managed. Sarah studied him like she was deciding whether she believed him. "Don't be," she said. "Earn it." Mark opened the folder and scanned the documents, trying to hold on to the comfort of tasks and timelines, but his awareness kept drifting back to her face, to the way her eyes stayed a second too long on him when she thought he wasn't looking. He cleared his throat, forcing himself to speak like this was normal. "Is there anything specific you want me to focus on first?" Sarah leaned back slightly, fingers resting on the desk as if she owned the air between them. "Pressure," she said simply. "How you handle it. How you lead when things go wrong." Mark nodded slowly. He'd handled pressure before, just not this kind. Not the kind that sat in front of him wearing a CEO title and a familiar face. He took a careful breath, then made a small observation about one of the timelines, pointing out a dependency that could cause delays. It wasn't a challenge, not intentionally, just an honest note. The reaction was immediate. Sarah's eyes narrowed just slightly, and her jaw tightened, a subtle shift that told him he'd touched a nerve. "We've already reviewed that," she said, tone sharper now. Mark felt heat rise in his face, part embarrassment, part irritation, because he wasn't wrong. He could have backed down, could have apologized, but something in him refused. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was the old version of himself who used to push back when Sarah teased him because he liked seeing her smile when he fought back. "I understand," he said carefully, "but if the vendor slips, it impacts the entire rollout. We should have a contingency." Sarah stared at him, and the room felt suddenly smaller. Then, unexpectedly, she nodded once. "Good," she said, almost like she was satisfied, but her expression stayed guarded. Mark exhaled, not realizing he'd been holding his breath. There was a pause after that, thick and heavy, full of everything they weren't saying. Sarah's gaze dropped briefly to his left hand, to the faint indentation where a wedding ring used to be, then lifted again to his eyes. "You have a child," she said, and it wasn't a question. Mark's chest tightened. He didn't know how she knew, whether she'd read his file or heard it somewhere, but hearing it from her felt strangely intimate. "Yes," he answered, keeping his voice steady. "A daughter." Sarah's face didn't soften, but something flickered behind her eyes, something that looked like surprise mixed with something deeper, like regret. "How old is she?" she asked, still calm, still controlled, but the question landed in Mark's stomach like a stone. 9, he said. Sarah nodded slowly as if she was filing it away, adding it to the mental picture she was building of him. Then she stood, signaling the meeting was over without saying so directly. "You'll start immediately. Daily updates. No excuses." Mark rose too, clutching the folder. "Understood," he replied. He made it to the door, hand on the handle, and then Sarah spoke again, quietly this time, just enough to make him pause. "You took a long time to show up," she said, voice flat, but the words carried weight that had nothing to do with work. Mark's fingers tightened on the handle. He turned back, heart pounding, but Sarah was already looking at her screen, the CEO mask back in place, like she hadn't just cracked open a wound neither of them had healed. Mark walked out of the office with his throat tight and his mind racing, knowing one thing with absolute certainty. Every meeting from now on was going to be a battle between who they were and who they pretended to be. By the end of Mark's first week, the job itself started to feel less like the problem and more like the backdrop to a problem he couldn't name out loud. The Horizon rollout was big, complicated, and high stakes, but Mark could handle big and complicated. What he couldn't handle was walking into meetings where Sarah's presence sharpened the air, where every sentence felt like it had a hidden hook in it, where he had to keep his face calm while his chest stayed tight. He worked early, stayed late, and answered emails fast, not because he wanted to impress anyone, but because he couldn't afford to give anyone a reason to doubt why he was there. Still, the attention followed him like a shadow. Sarah didn't treat him like the other new hires. She didn't ignore him either. She singled him out in subtle ways, direct questions in meetings, last-minute changes that only he was expected to accommodate, follow-up requests that bypassed his manager and landed straight in his inbox, always marked urgent. Mark kept telling himself it was because she saw competence, because the CEO recognized a good worker, but the way she watched him when she thought no one noticed didn't match that clean explanation. It was too personal, too aware. And people around them were starting to feel it, the way you feel the temperature shift when two people walk into a room carrying something unfinished. It began with looks, then quiet jokes, then that office thing where everyone pretends they're not paying attention while paying attention to everything. On Tuesday, after a project sync, Mark heard two people behind him whispering about how Sarah never stays past 5 unless the building is on fire, yet she'd stayed through the entire technical breakdown because Mark was presenting. On Wednesday, someone asked him casually if he'd worked with Sarah before, and when Mark said no, the person's smile tightened like they didn't believe him. On Thursday, Dev appeared at Mark's desk with 2 coffees instead of 1 and said, "I'm not trying to start anything, but you're on her radar in a way people usually aren't." Mark tried to laugh it off, tried to make it sound harmless. "Maybe she just wants the project done right," he said. Dev raised an eyebrow. "Sure," he replied, tone friendly but skeptical, then walked away like he'd said enough. Mark sat there staring at his screen, feeling that familiar pressure build, the same pressure he used to feel when Lily asked questions he wasn't ready to answer. Except in an office, questions didn't come from love. They came from curiosity, jealousy, and boredom. And once people decided you were interesting, they didn't let go easily. Mark tried to protect himself by being boring. He stopped eating lunch in the common area and started eating at his desk. He kept his answers short. He stayed focused on tasks. He avoided being alone with Sarah whenever he could without making it obvious. But avoidance is its own kind of signal. The more he tried to keep distance, the more certain people became that there was something to see. Even his manager, a calm man named Victor, who usually spoke in measured tones, started watching Mark more closely in meetings, as if trying to figure out whether Mark was a risk or an advantage. Mark felt trapped between 2 fears, that Sarah would push him too hard and make him fail, or that she would pull him too close and make people assume he didn't earn his position. Either way, it ended with him losing the stability he'd fought for, and he couldn't let that happen. Not when Lily depended on him. Not when every late-night promise he made to himself was tied to finally giving her a life that didn't feel like constant damage control. Sarah, meanwhile, seemed determined to keep the tension alive without ever naming it. In meetings, she spoke to him like he was an asset, but her tone had edges that didn't exist when she spoke to others. If Mark offered a solution, she either tested it aggressively or accepted it with a look that suggested she'd expected it from him all along. When he made a mistake, even a small one, she corrected him quickly, not cruelly, but in a way that felt like she wanted him to feel it. And yet, in those rare moments when the room cleared and it was just them, there were cracks in her control. Mark caught them the way you catch a reflection in a window, like the time she walked past his desk late one evening, slowed for half a second and said, "You work like someone who's afraid to lose everything," and kept going without waiting for an answer. Mark sat frozen after that, because she was right, and because the fact she saw it made him feel exposed. The office whispers grew sharper when Sarah started requesting daily updates directly from him. Not from Victor, not from the team lead, from Mark. Messages with short subject lines, no greetings, and short-line demands, like she was testing how fast he could run without collapsing. Mark replied quickly every time, but he could feel resentment building under his professionalism. One afternoon, after a long meeting where Sarah pressed him about timelines in front of everyone, Mark stepped into the hallway to breathe and found a woman from marketing leaning against the wall, pretending to scroll her phone. She glanced up and smiled too brightly. "You okay?" she asked. Mark nodded. "Fine," he said. She tilted her head. "Must be nice," she added. "Most of us would have to win a lottery to get that kind of attention." Mark didn't know what to say, because it wasn't nice. It was pressure wrapped in suspicion, and it made him feel like he was always one wrong move away from falling. That evening, Mark finally checked his phone and saw 3 missed calls from Lily's school. Panic hit him so hard it made his hands go cold. He called back immediately, heart pounding, only to learn Lily had a mild fever and the nurse had been trying to reach him while he was in meetings. Guilt stabbed deep, the kind that didn't fade just because the problem was manageable. He grabbed his bag and rushed out, but as he reached the elevator, he saw Sarah at the end of the corridor, speaking with 2 executives. Her eyes flicked to him, and something in her expression shifted when she saw the panic on his face. She excused herself from the conversation and walked towards him with that same controlled pace, but her voice was lower when she spoke. "What happened?" she asked. Mark hesitated, then answered honestly because he didn't have time for games. "My daughter's sick. I have to go." Sarah's gaze held his, and for the first time her CEO armor looked thinner than usual. She nodded once. "Go," she said, simple and direct, then added, almost under her breath, "Don't apologize for being a father." Mark blinked, surprised by the softness, by the fact that it felt like permission. He stepped into the elevator with his mind spinning, because that one sentence didn't match the cold pressure she'd been putting on him all week. And as the doors closed, Mark realized the whispers weren't the only danger. The real danger was that beneath all the tension and power games, there were still feelings alive between them, feelings neither of them seemed able to bury. And once feelings come back, they don't come back quietly. The following Monday began like a storm that didn't warn anyone before it hit. Mark arrived early, coffee in hand, only to find the office unusually quiet. The usual buzz of conversation was replaced by a strained silence that felt wrong. Within minutes, he knew why. A company-wide message had gone out overnight. There'd been a security breach, not just a small one. Sensitive data from the Horizon project had leaked, and internal access logs showed it came from someone inside. The email was vague, but the tone was unmistakable. Panic wrapped in professionalism. People huddled around their desks, whispering theories, eyes darting like they were afraid to be accused just for being there. Mark's phone buzzed. It was a meeting invite from Sarah's assistant. War room, now. No explanation, no details, just 2 words that made his stomach twist. By the time he reached the conference room, the atmosphere was heavy with tension. Screens covered the walls, displaying flowcharts, timelines, and network logs. Sarah stood at the center, calm but colder than he'd ever seen her. The calm of someone holding too much pressure and refusing to let it show. She glanced up as he entered, eyes sharp and calculating, then motioned for him to sit. The rest of the core team was already there, heads of IT, security, operations, and legal, each one looking like they'd been awake all night. Sarah started speaking immediately, outlining the breach in clipped sentences, no wasted words. Someone had accessed restricted files related to Horizon's launch strategy, and the intrusion had been routed internally. No outside hacks, no forced entries. It was an inside job. "We'll find out who did it," she said, voice steady, "and we'll fix it before the market finds out." Her gaze swept the room, stopping on Mark longer than it should have. Failure is not an option. For the next few hours, chaos turned into controlled urgency. Mark was assigned to the Incident Response Task Force, analyzing logs, comparing access trails, tracing permissions. It was the kind of deep technical work that normally focused him, but today it felt heavier. Sarah's voice echoed in his head every time he found something suspicious. How you handle pressure. He worked methodically, skipping lunch, ignoring messages, losing track of time. Around him, people spoke in short bursts of jargon, the language of crisis. Sarah moved between stations, giving orders with precision, but occasionally her composure slipped. Mark noticed her fingers tapping against her folder, a subtle rhythm she used to have when she was nervous in class before giving a presentation. That small human habit cut through her CEO armor for a second, reminding him that under the power and control, there was still the girl he once knew. Late in the afternoon, when the others left briefly for updates, Sarah stayed behind, standing by the window with her arms folded. The city stretched below, calm and unbothered, unaware that one wrong move could send shockwaves through her company. Mark hesitated before approaching her, but she spoke first without turning around. "I didn't expect you to walk back into my life like this." The words hit him like a sudden drop. He froze, caught off guard by how personal they sounded in a room full of cold facts. "Neither did I," he said quietly. Sarah turned then, her face unreadable but her eyes not as guarded. "I should have ignored your application," she continued, her voice tight, almost brittle. "It would have been easier." Mark frowned. "Then why didn't you?" She looked at him for a long moment, something flickering between anger and memory. "Because I needed someone I could trust," she said softly, "and because I never forgot you." The room felt smaller after that, the silence stretching between them like a bridge no one wanted to cross. Mark's chest ached with things he couldn't say. How could he explain the guilt that came with leaving the past behind? How could he tell her that every letter he didn't send haunted him in small, quiet ways? "I never meant to disappear," he said, voice low. "Life just got harder than I knew how to handle." Sarah looked away, a faint tremor in her jaw. "We all have stories like that," she said. "The difference is, some people use them as excuses, and some use them as reasons to build walls." She paused, breathing in deeply. "I built mine." Mark wanted to argue, but before he could, the door opened and the rest of the team filed back in. The moment was gone, sealed under professionalism. As the night wore on, patterns started emerging. Mark found irregular login timestamps on a senior executive's account, someone who wasn't even in the country at the time. He ran deeper checks, cross-referenced access points, and discovered something that made his stomach drop. The source of the leak had come from an executive terminal authorized by one of Sarah's oldest advisors. He double-checked everything, hoping he was wrong, but the trail was too clean, too deliberate. When he brought the evidence to Sarah, she didn't react immediately. Her face went blank, the kind of stillness that comes before something breaks. She stared at the data for a long time, then slowly closed the laptop, her fingers trembling just slightly. "No one else sees this yet," she said quietly. "Not until I confirm it." She stood, walked toward the door, then stopped. "Meet me on the rooftop in 10 minutes." Mark didn't understand why, but he went. The rooftop was dark and wide, the city glowing below like a distant ocean of light. Sarah stood near the edge, arms folded, wind tugging at her hair. She didn't turn when he stepped closer. "He was like family," she said low, "the person who did this." Mark stayed silent, letting her words settle. "When you build something from nothing, you believe loyalty is unbreakable. But it's not. It's a currency, and it runs out." Mark took a cautious step closer. "What do you need me to do?" Sarah finally looked at him, and in her eyes was a mix of exhaustion, anger, and something fragile beneath it all. "Find out if there's more," she said, but quietly. "I can't trust anyone else right now." Her voice faltered slightly before she caught herself. "And Mark, if they realize you're involved, you could lose everything too." Mark nodded, heart heavy. "Then I guess we both have something to lose." Sarah didn't smile, but something in her gaze softened just enough to show she heard what he meant. The wind whipped around them, cold and restless, as if even the city knew that this night had changed everything. Mark barely slept after the rooftop conversation. Not because he didn't try, but because his brain wouldn't stop running through worst-case scenarios like a machine with a stuck gear. He lay on the edge of his bed listening to Lily's soft breathing from the next room, staring into the dark and thinking about how fragile everything was. A single job had been his lifeline, and now that lifeline was tangled in a corporate betrayal and a woman from his past who carried power like a weapon. By the time morning came, he'd already decided two things. He was going to protect his daughter no matter what, and he was going to find the truth for Sarah, even if part of him still didn't know where he stood with her as a person. He got Lily ready for school with a calmer face than he felt, tied her shoelaces, brushed her hair, smiled through her chatter, and only when she walked out the door did he let his shoulders drop. Then he drove to the office with his jaw clenched, rehearsing how he'd move quietly, how he'd keep his name out of sight, how he'd do the work without drawing attention. The building looked the same from the outside, sleek and confident, but inside the energy was different, more watchful. People greeted each other with tighter smiles. Conversations stopped when someone approached. The breach had turned the place into a room full of strangers pretending they were still a team. Mark went straight to his desk and opened the logs again. Not the sanitized reports the security team shared, but the raw entries he'd copied the night before. He traced the executive terminal access deeper, tracking device IDs, session tokens, the exact times files were pulled and where they were sent. The more he looked, the clearer it became that whoever did this wasn't just stealing data, they were setting someone up. The access trail was almost too obvious, like it was meant to be found, but only after the damage was done. Mark's stomach tightened as he noticed a pattern. The executive account used in the breach had multiple failed login attempts the week before, followed by a successful session from an internal VPN endpoint that wasn't assigned to that executive. That meant credentials were either stolen or shared. Either way, it wasn't an accident. He pulled up badge access records, cross-referenced them with the timeline, and found something that made his skin go cold. The badge used to enter the secure floor during the breach window belonged to someone Sarah had mentioned on the rooftop, one of her earliest advisors, the person she trusted like family. Mark stared at the name, hoping he was reading it wrong, but it sat there like a verdict. He ran the query again, same result. He leaned back, breathing hard, and for a second all he could think about was Lily. If this turned into a legal mess, if Sarah's company decided to pin the whole thing on the new guy, his life could collapse in a week. He forced himself to focus. Fear didn't solve anything. Evidence did. He moved carefully after that, avoiding the main channels, using limited queries that wouldn't trigger alerts, documenting everything offline. He found an encrypted transfer log that linked the stolen files to an external storage endpoint, and from there, a subtle connection to a competitor's shell vendor. The chain was real, the betrayal was real, and the deeper he went, the more it looked like Sarah's advisor wasn't working alone. There were approvals tied to a private executive group, the kind of group only a handful of people could even see. Mark's hand shook as he read the list, because 2 of the names were people who'd been in the war room, sitting 2 seats away from him, acting outraged, acting loyal. He swallowed hard, saved the evidence, and closed everything down. He didn't want to be caught staring at a trail that could get him fired or worse. He checked his watch. It was close to midnight again, and the office had thinned out, but lights still glowed in a few corners like the building refused to sleep. He messaged Sarah with a short note. "I found something. Rooftop?" The reply came fast. 10 minutes. No emojis, no softness, just urgency. Mark took the service elevator up, the kind reserved for maintenance because it had fewer cameras. When the doors opened, the rooftop air hit him like a slap, cold and sharp. Sarah was already there, standing near the edge with the city spread behind her like a glittering map. She didn't look like a billionaire up here. She looked tired, like she'd been carrying the weight of her own success for too long. Mark walked toward her, keeping his voice low. "It's worse than we thought," he said, and handed her the printed summary he'd made. Sarah read without moving, eyes scanning fast, jaw tightening with each line. When she reached the names, her face changed. Not shocked exactly, more like a deep, silent disappointment settling into her bones. She looked up at him, and for the first time her composure didn't feel like strength. It felt like survival. "They built this plan to corner me," she said, quietly. "If Horizon fails, the board can force a change. If data leaks, investors panic. If it looks like my leadership is unstable, they win." Mark nodded, heart pounding. "And they'll need someone to blame," he said. Sarah's eyes locked on his, and something passed between them, a shared understanding that made the air feel tighter. "They'll blame you," she said, blunt and honest. "Because you're new, because you have access, because you're close to me." Mark almost laughed, but there was nothing funny about it. "Close?" he repeated, and the word carried an edge because he didn't know what they were, and he hated that it mattered. Sarah took a step closer, wind tugging at her coat. "You need to hear this from me," she said, voice steady but quieter than usual. "I knew it was you the moment your application came in." Mark's chest tightened. "You hired me?" he said, not fully asking, not fully accusing. Sarah nodded once. "Yes," she said. "I told myself it was business, a familiar name, a skill set I needed. But the truth is, I couldn't ignore it." Mark stared at her, feeling anger rise because it sounded like she'd pulled her into a storm without warning him. "So you dragged me into your world and didn't think I deserved to know?" he said, voice low. Sarah's expression flickered, a crack of guilt, then hardened again. "I didn't know it would get this bad, and I didn't know if I could trust you." Mark exhaled sharply. "You didn't know if you could trust me," he repeated, and it stung because trust was the thing he'd ruined when he was a kid. Sarah reached into her coat pocket then and pulled out a small envelope, worn at the corners like it had been carried a long time. She held it out to him. Mark recognized his own writing on the front and felt his breath catch. "I kept this," she said. "The letter you wrote. It finally reached me, years later.
after I'd already learned not to wait. Mark's fingers hovered near it, afraid to touch it, like it might burn. I wrote that, he whispered, and the words sounded like grief. Before he could take the envelope, Sarah's phone buzzed. The sound was loud in the quiet night. She glanced down, and color drained from her face so fast it scared him. Mark watched her eyes move across the screen, watched her shoulders stiffen. "What is it?" he asked. Sarah didn't answer immediately. She swallowed, then looked up at him with something raw in her expression, something that didn't belong on a CEO's face. "They know," she said, voice barely above the wind. "Someone just sent me proof you're investigating." Mark's heart slammed. "How?" he demanded, scanning the rooftop like someone might be listening. Sarah's hand tightened around the phone. "And," she added, "they're coming for you next." Mark took a step toward her, adrenaline lighting up his veins, and at that exact moment his own phone buzzed. Unknown number, one line of text. "Bring your daughter to the meeting tomorrow, or you'll regret it." Mark's blood ran cold, and the city below suddenly felt far away and helpless.
If you want the full fallout from that rooftop message, subscribe to Drew Daily Stories. Like the video and comment rooftop so I know you're watching till the end.